Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
Last time we discussed Gorm, and now we're discussing the Assyrian conquest of the Hyborian region. Mostly the Assyrians and Venerians ended up swarming, to use Howard's language, the entirety of the region. The Picts did manage to hold on to Aquilonia eventually, and part of Zingara, but east of Vilayet, nothing. What's more is that though the Assyrians who dominated Numidia became known as the Numidians, they later figured in Irish history according to the Hyborian Age essay, which brings us to the next point. Howard begins to kind of phase out his fantasy in favor of actual history and historical ethnicities and groups. There's too many to actually mention. You've got Stygian, for example, which is broken in the next cataclysm in the continental drift. You've got Stygia that's conquered by Venerians, according to him, and they become the Egyptians. The Nordics, who are descended from the Hyborians. You have many tribes that end up migrating into what is now known as India, Asia Minor, and Central and Western Europe. You have these countries became known as Aryans, which I know we have a lot of negative connotations due to Hitler over that, but at the time, this was an ongoing historical theory. And the drift of blonde barbarians across a great deal of Europe, he basically breaks it up into multiple groups and sub-ethnicities. So he's not exactly sticking to all the theories, I think. As to the Asian tribes, the Tatars, Huns, Mongols, and Turks, which, of course, because Mongols themselves are descended from the Xiongnu people who inhabited the steppes. And the steppe nomads are the ancestors of the Huns, the Turks, the Mongols. All of them are steppe nomads. This part of the essay is not terribly interesting because I love history, but it starts to go from fantasy to history and generally the kind of history that's not terribly interesting. What is fascinating, though, is that his last sentence in his essay is, "The origins of other races of the modern world may be similarly traced, in almost every case older far than they realize. Their history stretches back into the mist of the forgotten Hyborian age," which is really cool. But what are your thoughts on it?
I found it rather jarring because here it is, I'm immersed in a fantasy world on all of the background lore, and then it shifts into a real history. I don't like it when fantasy does that.
Well, at the time they kind of had to, because they're pioneering. Howard and Tolkien did this. Part of it was to help cement and enmesh it into our world. I get why they did it. It's called a frame narrative. The idea behind a frame narrative is that it's something that actually did happen, and then you frame it in the context of our real world. Tolkien used the Red Book of Westmarch, which is basically the tales of the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, all placed together, and that in time this made its way into the hands of Tolkien, who was a descendant of Elfwine, who was himself a descendant of the Númenórean people via Aragorn. This narrative was Tolkien having a little fun, but on the other hand, it's not very interesting. It removes some of the otherworldly elements of Middle-earth to an extent, but on the other hand, it's still a little interesting. Howard suggested that the history was something that disappeared for a while, but then was rediscovered by him in a book he found in Texas. So he basically used a similar idea, except his idea is not that he himself is, I think, descended from Conan, though he might have implied it in a letter, so I'm not sure. All I know is I've heard that he did. I haven't actually gotten that far in my letter reading, which this is a good moment for you guys to go check out the letters I have read of Howard over on the Instagram page. Both Howard and Tolkien use frame narratives. This was a common practice at the time for fantasy storytellers, but it eventually fell out of favor so that they just developed other worlds so that you could just escape, because the idea is escape. Although Tolkien himself stated his world is a secondary world wherein you can escape it. If you don't want the frame narrative, you don't need to go with it. So he called his world a secondary world. I'm not terribly fond of mixing fantasy world with history, so I get you there.
I love the aspect of cultures evolving and tribal evolution.
That aspect was always a strong point of Howard's works. Let's rate this story, because it is a story. I actually think this is easily a 3.3. This is how you build a world. Well, actually, I'm going to lower it to a 3.5. There are some flaws here, which we just went over, and we've gone over the course of this book club, so to speak.
3.5. It's just this last portion that really
weakened it for you?
Weakened it for me. The immersion was broken. If I want to read historical fantasy, I'd seek it out.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We won't belabor the point from this point on. Next time, for the Hyborian Age, we'll be reading and reviewing and rating the poem Samaria, written by Robert E. Howard. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to smash that like and that subscribe button like you're Gorm smashing his enemies into shreds.